There are so many things that I don't know and I don't have answers to, but there are some things that I do know, and that I know that if a jury knew, that they would have come to a different decision. The issue with the ballistics and the gun, they would have found out that the shell casings found there didn't match the weapon that they're saying is the murder weapon. That still hasn't been brought up in any of the court hearings.
Hearing Frances, you'll wonder why there were so many questionable things in this case, and why she was still executed after all. This is the case of Frances Newton, the first black woman to be executed in Texas, and many experts believe Texas may have executed an innocent woman, as the case has been recorded as the most controversial case in the history of Texas executions. Before we get into this story, please subscribe to our channel to stay updated on chilling crime stories. Imagine that you come home after visiting family. Your husband is lying on the living room floor, blood everywhere, a gunshot wound to his head. You run to the back bedroom, hoping your children are safe, but they're not. Your 7-year-old son and your 20-month-old daughter are both dead. Both shot, you call 911, screaming, crying, begging for help. But when the police arrive, they don't see you as a grieving mother and wife. They see you as their #1 suspect. This is exactly what happened to Frances Newton on April 7, 1987, and it's where our story begins. But before we go any further, make sure you subscribe and hit that bell icon, because this case has more twists than you can imagine. Frances Newton was 21 years old, a young mother working at a grocery store to support her family. Her husband Adrian was 23. He worked construction when he could find jobs. They weren't rich, but they were trying to build a life together with their 2 kids, Alton, who was 7, and baby Farah, just 20 months old. On that April night, Frances said she had been visiting her cousin across town. She claimed she came home around 11 p.m. and found the horror waiting for her. No signs of a break-in. Nothing stolen, just 3 dead bodies and a family destroyed forever. The Houston police arrived within minutes. What they found puzzled them. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't a random home invasion. The killer had used a .25 caliber pistol, small bullets, but deadly. Each victim was shot once. Clean, efficient, almost professional. But here's what made investigators suspicious right away. Frances Newton seemed too calm, too composed for someone who had just discovered her entire family murdered. The officers started asking questions, hard questions, and Frances's answers didn't add up. She said she had been at her cousin's house all evening, but when police checked, the cousin's story was different. Where had she been for those missing hours? Frances couldn't explain. Within hours, Houston police had made their decision. Frances Newton wasn't a victim. She was their prime suspect. Now, what happened next is where this case gets really complicated. The police started digging into Frances Newton's life, and what they found made them even more suspicious. Just a few months before the murders, Frances had taken out life insurance policies on her family. $50,000 total. That might not sound like much today, but in 1987, that was serious money for a young family living paycheck to paycheck. The police saw this as a smoking gun. Here was the motive they needed. Frances Newton had killed her family for the insurance money. But Frances insisted the insurance was just responsible planning. Young families need protection, she said. There was nothing sinister about it. Then came the physical evidence that would seal Frances Newton's fate. When police tested her hands and clothes for gunshot residue, they found it. Tiny particles that proved she had recently fired a gun. Frances tried to explain this away, saying she had touched her husband's body when she found him, but the prosecution wasn't buying it. The final nail in the coffin came during a search of Frances's belongings. Hidden in her purse, police found a .25 caliber pistol, the same type of gun used in the murders. When ballistics experts tested it, they made a stunning discovery. This was the murder weapon. Frances Newton was arrested and charged with 3 counts of capital murder. The case seemed open and shut, but it was far from over. Frances Newton's trial began in October 1988. The prosecutor painted her as a cold, calculating killer who murdered her own children for money. They presented the insurance policies, the gunshot residue, and most importantly, the murder weapon found in her purse. The evidence seemed overwhelming. But Frances Newton's defense team fought back with their own version of events. They argued that Frances was a loving mother who could never hurt her children. They suggested that the real killers were never found because police focused on Francis too quickly. They pointed out that Adrian Newton had been involved with some questionable people. Maybe this was about drugs. Maybe it was about money he owed. Maybe Francis and her children were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The defense also raised questions about the investigation itself. Why had police been so quick to focus on Francis? Why hadn't they looked harder for other suspects? And what about those missing hours in Francis's timeline? Maybe she had been having an affair. Maybe she was somewhere she didn't want to admit. That didn't make her a murderer. But the prosecution had one advantage the defense couldn't overcome. That gun in Francis's purse. How do you explain away the murder weapon in the defendant's possession? Frances Newton took the stand in her own defense. She looked the jury in the eyes and swore she was innocent. She cried as she talked about finding her children's bodies. She begged the jury to believe her. It wasn't enough. After just 2 hours of deliberation, the jury found Frances Newton guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to death. Frances Newton, at just 22 years old, was headed to death row. But this is where our story takes a dramatic turn. Because once Frances Newton was on death row, her new legal team started digging deeper into the case. And what they found was absolutely shocking. Remember that gun? The one found in Frances's purse that supposedly matched the murder weapon. Well, it turns out there was a problem. A big problem. The gun had actually been tested twice. The first test, done shortly after the murders, showed that it was not the murder weapon. The bullets didn't match. Months later, a different ballistics expert tested the same gun, and suddenly, it was a match. How does that happen? How does the same gun go from not matching to matching the murder bullets? Frances's new lawyers had 3 theories. Either the evidence had been tampered with, the testing was flawed, or the guns had been switched. Any of these possibilities meant that Frances Newton had been convicted on false evidence. But there was more. Frances's original defense lawyer had never handled a death penalty case before. He was in over his head from day one. He failed to present crucial evidence. He failed to call important witnesses. He failed to challenge the prosecution's case effectively. One of the biggest mistakes, he never brought in his own ballistics expert. If he had, they might have discovered the testing problems years earlier. The new legal team also found witnesses who said they had seen suspicious people near the Newton apartment on the night of the murders. These witnesses had never been contacted by police. The investigation had focused so heavily on Frances that other leads were never pursued. And that gunshot residue on Frances's hands, expert witnesses now said it could easily be explained by Frances touching her husband's body or simply being in an apartment where 3 people had been shot recently. Piece by piece, Frances Newton's conviction was falling apart. But she was still on death row, and Texas was preparing to execute her. By 2005, Frances Newton had been on death row for 17 years. She had exhausted most of her appeals. Her execution date was set for September 14th. But something unprecedented happened. As the execution date approached, people started paying attention to Frances Newton's case. Civil rights groups picked up her story. Legal experts began questioning her conviction. Even some prosecutors started having doubts. The case that had seemed so clear-cut in 1988 now looked very different in 2005. Governor Rick Perry found himself in an impossible position. He had already rejected Frances Newton's clemency petition, but the questions about her case were getting louder and louder. Could Texas really execute someone when there were so many doubts about her guilt? Just hours before Frances was scheduled to die, Governor Perry did something almost unheard of. He granted a reprieve. Frances Newton would get to live for another 4 months while additional DNA testing was conducted. This was Frances Newton's last chance. If the DNA evidence could prove her innocence, she might finally go free. If not, she would die. For 4 months, Frances waited. Her supporters held vigils. Her legal team worked around the clock. The entire country watched as Texas prepared to possibly execute an innocent woman. Finally, the DNA results came back. They were inconclusive. The evidence was too old, too degraded to provide the clear answers everyone hoped for. Governor Perry announced he would not grant another reprieve. Frances Newton's new execution date was set for December 14, 2005. On December 14, 2005, Protesters gathered outside the Huntsville unit, where Texas carries out its executions. They held signs reading "innocent" and "stop the execution." Some had been following Frances Newton's case for years. Inside the prison, Frances Newton spent her final hours with her spiritual advisor and her legal team. She continued to maintain her innocence. She wrote letters to her surviving family members. She prepared to die for crimes she insisted she didn't commit. At 6 p.m., she was led into the execution chamber. She was strapped to a gurney and connected to the 4 lines that would deliver the lethal injection. Asked if she had any final words, Frances Newton looked toward the witnesses and spoke clearly. "I am innocent. The people who did this to my family are still out there. I want my family to know that I love them. I am not angry, but I am disappointed that I was convicted of something I did not do." The drugs were administered at 6:07 p.m. At 6:12 p.m., Frances Newton was pronounced dead. She was 40 years old. Frances Newton became the first black woman executed in Texas since 1858. She was only the 3rd woman executed in Texas since the death penalty was brought back in 1976, but her death didn't end the controversy. If anything, it made it worse. In the years since Frances Newton's execution, her case has been studied by legal experts, journalists, and criminal justice reform advocates around the world. Many now consider her execution one of the biggest mistakes in American legal history. The problems with her case are staggering. The questionable ballistics evidence, the inadequate legal representation, the rush to judgment, the failure to investigate other suspects, the inconclusive DNA evidence that came too late to save her life. But perhaps most troubling of all, new information has continued to emerge even after Frances Newton's death. In 2007, just 2 years after the execution, a former Houston Crime Lab employee came forward with shocking allegations. He claimed that evidence in high-profile cases, including death penalty cases, had been mishandled or potentially tampered with during the 1980s and 90s. While he didn't specifically mention Frances Newton's case, the timeline matched perfectly. Her case was from 1987, right in the middle of the period when problems allegedly occurred. Other forensic experts have also raised questions about the gunshot residue evidence. Modern testing has shown that gunshot residue can transfer in many ways that weren't understood in the 1980s. Simply being in a room where someone had been shot could leave residue on your hands and clothes. And what about those insurance policies that prosecutors said provided the motive? Frances Newton's supporters point out that $50,000, while significant, hardly seems worth killing your own children for. They argue that a mother would have to be truly evil to murder her babies for such a relatively small amount of money. The more you look at this case, the more questions arise. Questions that can never be answered now because Frances Newton is dead. So what really happened on that April night in 1987? Did Frances Newton murder her husband and children in cold blood? Or was she an innocent woman failed by a system that was supposed to protect her? The truth is, we may never know for certain. The evidence is contradictory. The investigation was flawed. The legal representation was inadequate. And the person who could have provided answers is no longer alive to give them. What we do know is that Frances Newton's case has become a symbol of everything that can go wrong in death penalty cases. It shows us how unreliable forensic evidence can be, how important good legal representation is, how dangerous it can be when investigators make up their minds too quickly. Frances Newton's case has led to reforms in how forensic evidence is handled in Texas. It has sparked conversations about the quality of legal representation for poor defendants. It has made people think twice about the death penalty itself. Whether Frances Newton was guilty or innocent, her case serves as a powerful reminder that our justice system is run by human beings, and human beings make mistakes. The question is, in a system that can sentence people to death, how many mistakes are acceptable? Frances Newton died maintaining her innocence. 18 years after her execution, the debate about her guilt continues. Some people are absolutely convinced she was guilty. Others are equally convinced she was innocent. What do you think? Was Frances Newton a cold-blooded killer who got what she deserved? Or was she an innocent woman executed by a system that failed her? Let me know in the comments below. And if you found this case as fascinating and troubling as I do, make sure you subscribe for more deep dives into the most controversial cases in American criminal justice, because the truth is often more complicated than it first appears. The case of Frances Newton reminds us that behind every headline, every conviction, and every execution, there are real people whose lives hang in the balance. And sometimes the system gets it wrong. If you want to watch more crime stories, click the next video on your screen. See you in the text video.